Yo, this is probably my favorite medium format camera. Let's talk about it.
This is always the difficult part. And as you know, this moves a little bit slower since it's filmed. 1, 2, perfect.
What is good? Welcome back to the channel. So we're talking about the Mamiya C330, which is a TLR camera, shoots medium format. And I absolutely adore this camera for a couple different reasons. Number one, this camera is beautiful. TLRs in general are beautiful cameras. You know, it doesn't matter which one you have. Most of them look pretty damn cool, especially when they're even older. The older, the cooler. This is from the 70s, so it's got nice retro appeal, but it's not super antique. But nonetheless, it looks like a traditional TLR, except it looks like it took some steroids, been in the gym, and got big. Because look at this thing, it's huge. It's like the size of my face. But I love this camera, and the size of it is probably one of the key things to talk about because most people say this is too big compared to other TLR cameras. It's definitely bigger than most TLR cameras, if not all of them, other than like its big brother camera, the C3, I think it's what it's called. Either way, TLR cameras are all typically slightly smaller despite having this form factor. Like for example, you can check in the video above, I also have a Rolleiflex camera, which I absolutely love. It's much smaller, it's much older, much more antique. And it's much lighter too, so it's a little bit easier on the neck when you're carrying it around, but this doesn't really bother me because, you know, I got that Mike Tyson neck. But either way, I love this camera for what it is in terms of, you know, the style of camera and the spot that it occupies in the medium format space. This is a very kind of affordable way to get into medium format photography if you're thinking about it. Maybe not this camera, but of course TLRs in general. Other thing I want to talk about this camera is the lens. And specifically, not just only this lens, but the lenses that you can get with this camera. That's right, this camera has interchangeable lenses. Most TLRs have a fixed lens, which means what you get in there is fully attached, you can't remove it. This camera, by pulling this little, you know, lever right there, which I'm not gonna do right now, you can remove this lens and put on other lenses that are part of the kit. I don't know exactly how many lenses exist for this camera, but I think it's maybe 3 or 4 different lenses ranging in focal lengths. This is the 80, which is pretty standard for medium format. 80 millimeter, 75 millimeter is kind of the standard you get with most medium format cameras. With this one, I actually have a 250 millimeter lens as well. I can't show it to you right now because it's not here in London with me. I actually left it in the US. But when I go back to the US, I'll obviously be using it so you can check it out. So being able to change the lenses here is fantastic, especially if you have managed to damage the lens. If something happens to your lens and you have no choice but to, you know, get a different one, you can. With other TLRs, if you mess up the lens, you're kind of screwed unless you can find someone to repair a lens. But if you crack the glass, for example, I don't think that's something you're gonna be able to get repaired. So being able to buy one and replace it, it's a nice piece of insurance kind of in your mind that can make you feel better about owning a camera like this. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually the usability of this camera. This camera has a couple key features that make it extremely usable. Real quick, the first one is the actual shutter trigger. So you've got the standard button, which is typically down here in most TLR cameras, but you also have this one right here that's for the thumb. And I love this because it gives you both options. If you hold this camera, some version of like this, you can use your pointer finger just to trigger it right there, or you can use the thumb to trigger it, which is right there. Both feel very natural, but I think the thumb feels a bit more natural. I will say though, if you're not, you know, very tight, if you don't have the camera in kind of a secure place, the thumb might not be ideal because given that it's higher up on the camera body, when you trigger it and press it down, it could make the camera move slightly as compared to just using this button down here, since that's kind of where all the control is. So just something to think about. But I use the thumb pretty much 95% of the time. And typically it's okay. Not all my shots are in focus, which we'll talk about in a second. But I don't think it's because of motion blur, because of moving the camera. So that's the first thing you want to talk about, usability. The other thing is focusing. This camera has these giant wheels right here, which are extremely useful for focusing. And it's on both sides too. So you can kind of fine tune it. You can use it however you need to. Most TLRs only have it on one side, typically on the other side here. And you have to use your other hand to kind of get the focus. You know, I think it's nice to have two options, but look at this. You ready for this? Look at that. This is what separates this camera from basically almost every other TLR. Most TLRs do not have bellows, which means you have a pretty typical focal range. You've got your close focusing, which is probably, let's say 3 feet on most TLRs. And then of course, all the way to infinity. This camera lets you go past that minimum focusing distance And because you have bellows, this camera basically becomes a macro camera, or I guess the lens becomes a macro lens. The further you extend the bellows, the closer you can get to your subject. And that's huge. That's very, very useful if you're doing macro photography, of course. But I think it's really useful for portraiture as well, because portraiture is one of those scenarios where sometimes, you know, getting closer to your subject and really focusing on like this much of their face is extremely useful. And with a lot of medium format cameras, you can't do that because the lens doesn't let you get that close. With this camera, you don't have to worry about that. You basically have an infinite number of options for close focusing all the way to the full extension of the bellows. That's dope. A couple more kind of standard things to mention. You've got single and you've got multiple exposure modes. Don't really have to get into that. I don't really use multiple exposures that much, or maybe ever, honestly, but you know, you have it. And maybe it's a good idea to use it. Maybe I should kind of focus on doing that and try to learn something here. The last thing I want to mention about this camera is that because this camera is old, there's two different settings on the lens in terms of how you can trigger the actual, you know, aperture to open and how that relates to the flash syncing on this camera. I don't really know all the details here, but the key thing to mention is that there's two modes on the lens. You've got an M and an X. The M pertains to the more antiquated style of triggering the camera. And all I know is that when you have it on the M, you're more likely to have your lens not be triggered at all. So you'll press the shutter and you'll actually, you know, engage and you'll hear a sound. The actual mechanics, something will happen, but within the lens itself, the aperture will not open up for the time that it's supposed to open up. It might not even open up at all. And that's obviously a huge problem because you think you got a photo and in fact you didn't get anything. And that's what happened to me in Sweden. Remember this video right here? Check out the link right there. I took this camera with me and 2 entire rolls of film completely blank. And it wasn't because I messed up the developing. Everybody was like, oh, you messed it up. There's no rebate. So Barra film doesn't have rebate on it on 120. And my Kodak Portra 800 roll, that had the rebate on it. So clearly I didn't mess it up developing. It's just this camera, specifically the lens, wasn't being triggered properly because I accidentally shifted it onto that M mode. If you leave your lens on X, you don't have to worry about anything. Again, I don't know how to exactly explain that, but I did a bunch of research and ultimately figured that that was the problem. And it wasn't that I broke the camera or that I messed up developing. It's that the setting was on the wrong one. So use the X setting. Don't ask me any questions, but that'll guarantee that you get images on your camera or on your film, I guess. It's not a digital camera. Last thing to mention here is kind of the obvious thing. This is a TLR, which means you have your waist level viewfinder. And waist level viewfinders are amazing. As you can see on Instagram and everywhere, people love looking through them because it kind of transports you to this other world. The scene in front of you looks significantly cooler through there than, you know, through your own eyes directly. So waist level viewfinders are great for that. And of course, you can hold it in front of you. You can, you know, take your phone or a camera, whatever, and, you know, get your little video recording of the waist level viewfinder. This one has a fairly bright waist level viewfinder, which is great. The ground glass is nice and big. And that's very important, but that's also the key thing about usability. If you've never used the waist level viewfinder, there's gonna take time for you to get used to it. There's a slight learning curve to it because your kind of whole world gets turned upside down. When you move the camera to the left, it looks like you're moving it to the right. And if you wanna move it to the right when you're looking through here, you should actually move it to the left. Same thing for up and down. That becomes very, very confusing in certain occasions. You know, you kind of get used to it, especially when you're doing things outside in the street where things are kind of out in front of you. But if you're doing portraiture, especially if you're trying to get cool and get all these interesting angles and all this stuff, that gets pretty damn confusing because everything is kind of the other way around. This TLR, fortunately, was designed for kind of studio use. This was meant to be a one-stop shop. So they actually sell an eye level viewfinder that you can attach on top of there instead of the waist level. And then that way you can use it like a more traditional, let's say, SLR. This is obviously not an SLR, but you would hold it like this and the eye level view piece would be right here. And it has mirrors in there which kind of flip everything to make it right side up. So at that point, you're not confused anymore about which way you're supposed to be looking. So maybe I'll invest in that one day because I really love using this camera, but in the studio, it's not ideal. I've used it in the studio, I've gotten great results, but again, it is not exactly ideal. Let's actually look at some photos here and some prints. Like I said, I've used this camera for a ton of stuff and I just love using it because I think it's fun, but also the images you get are just amazing because this lens is sharp. It's great. It's got interesting character, but it's not too kind of old school. You've got portraits here. You've got street photography. You've got wide shots, tight shots. It doesn't matter. This camera can do it all with this lens. So I would highly, highly recommend if you want a really quality TLR camera and you can't afford a Rolleiflex, or you already have a Rolleiflex, or you just don't want a super old camera, this is the thing to buy, because honestly it has more features than the Rolleiflex. It's just as cool. The only downside is it's bigger, and bigger is not always a bad thing. For me, it's not really a problem. For some other people, it might be. So definitely check this camera out. And just remember, this is not the only Mamiya TLR that exists. C330 is the one that I have, and I like it because of the functionality. But there's a cheaper model, the C220, and then there's another kind of model. I think it's the C33 or C3. Just look it up and you'll find it. But there's options. So shop around, try to figure out what exactly it is that you want. But if you just want to take my word for it and cop this one, go ahead and do it, because you're not going to regret it. All right, y'all. That's what I got for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, of course, click that like button to help me out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, welcome to the club. Come and subscribe, y'all. All right, y'all. I'm out.